Welcome, everyone. I'm Gabriel de Guzman, Director of Arts at Wave Hill. Thank you all for joining us for this Meet the Artist with Shoshanna Weinberger, whose project Fragments of Perception is on view in the sun porch at Wave Hill's Glendor Gallery. Before we start, I'd like to mention that the chat function is available for you to use for general comments or if you want to give a shout out. We also have the Q&A function, and that is what you should use to ask the participants any questions. We may answer those either during the conversation or toward the end of the program. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have Curator of Visual Arts, Eileen Jang Lynch, who will be leading the conversation with Shoshanna. Hi, Eileen. And I'm also pleased to present artist Shoshanna Weinberger. Shoshanna Weinberger's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. Weinberger has participated, or Shoshanna has participated in the Jamaica and Martinique Biennales. She has had recent solo exhibitions at Long Gallery in Harlem, Trestle Gallery in Brooklyn, Project for Empty Space in Newark, New Jersey. And she's been included in a two-person show at Nomad Gallery in Brussels, Belgium. Concurrent with her show here at Wave Hill, Shoshanna has work included in the group exhibition Born in Flames at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, and in the exhibition called If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home by Now at Wasaic Project. Shoshanna received an MFA from the Yale School of Art and a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Welcome. And Eileen, I'll go ahead and let you take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you, Shoshanna, for being here. Really delighted about this. You're kicking off the first program in the Meet the Artist series for the Sunroom Project Space. And just to provide a little bit of information for everyone about the Sunroom Project Space, this program is dedicated for solo shows for emerging artists. And we have an open call, and we'll actually have the next open call posted later this month. So Shoshanna, I wanted to share with everyone that we're excited to speak with you, and we're also going to have a special guest speaker, Gyun Her, joining us at the end of this conversation. And I'm wondering if you'd like to start by doing a brief walkthrough of your installation at Wave Hill.
Sure thing. I would like to first say thank you, Gabriel, and thank you, Eileen, and thank you to the whole Wave Hill community. It's been really wonderful, and it's been much anticipated due to the pandemic and it being a postponed show. So I'm really excited to actually show the walkthrough virtually. So.
So Shoshanna, I really enjoy seeing the movement in the piece and also the birds chirping. I know the movement is caused by the windows being open, but also when you walk into the space, it also subtly moves as bodies move that as well. I'm wondering if you can talk to us about Fragments of Perception.
Yes. Fragments of Perception came about by really sort of like getting wanting to utilize the light at the sun porch. And when I first started to come and do site visits and look at the space, that the light was something I wanted to play off with. The materials that I'm using are about reflection, about going in and out of space. And this piece was about kind of bringing in the fauna and flora from the Caribbean and utilizing it as an archetype for my identity, which I've done in the past with other artworks and other archetypes. And so in this case, I wanted it to move and flow and reflect, really inspired by the plant life, inspired by the aquatic pool, which we'll talk more about, and wanted to kind of make an illusion, make things look like you could see them, you can't see them. I wanted it to be slightly disorienting. I wanted it to move with people's bodies as they walked around this space, and really enjoying the way the materiality and the environment play off each other, with the air coming out, with opening the windows, with maybe a dark day and the light coming through and the skylights above. And, that kind of idea of transformation of space, but then also there's an ambiguity to the work that I wanted to play off of, which is an extension of my mark making.
And so you talked about the material that you used, this double-sided acrylic mirror, and you've mentioned that these are materials that are similar to those that you used in previous work, but you're really moving in a different direction from both your three-dimensional sculptures and also the works on paper that feature your muse Strange Fruit. So I'm wondering if you could talk us more through that.
Yeah, I think that, this site-specific piece and this project was a really positive challenge for me in my studio practice. Sort of veering away from using my muse Strange Fruit, which is reoccurring figure, and really kind of tackling how I was going to sort of utilize her as an archetype, and also kind of bring in the idea of home and architecture and place and space. And so in the past, I've done, this is just a quick picture, a little maquette of the Strange Fruit figure that sits on this double-sided mirror, and really loving the idea of fractals in space and how once they're put together next to each other, they sort of go in and out of focus. And so in this case, I wanted to play up with the idea of fragments of perception by giving you fragments of what you can or cannot see, and how the sort of ferns in this space sort of reflect, and sometimes I like to always say absorb the images in this space, and using laser cut technology and working in collaboration with the Form Design Studio in Newark was really a wonderful way for me to sort of push and challenge my mark making, using files and making it with my hand, and then utilizing technology to sort of play with this outcome was really exciting to me. And the fact that they could become almost natural in their formations, even though they're extruded acrylic, made in a factory. And so the idea that I could play and push and transform them into objects that may seem natural in the environment.
But this connection to nature, and then you had mentioned fractals, like that occurs in nature as well. So it's really interesting to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that these works play with that idea in nature, that they become formations that grow in symmetry, and in some cases they have some irregularities that are then symmetrical in how we see them in their nature. And so I wanted to sort of continue to keep the figure, but remove it. And so that was a really great challenge. I think it was a challenge from the curator perspective. And I really, as an artist, I find that the space sometimes doesn't necessarily dictate, but it definitely pushes, and it pushed me to really think about my material and how I was going to utilize it as one whole piece.
Should we take a look at some of your earlier work?
Sure.
To see the new direction.
That's a nice close-up, yeah.
So you can see the heels, right?
Right. Yeah, in my strange fruit figure. So they're sort of, kind of utilizing and sort of dissecting beauty norms and beauty criterion. And so the idea of hair, lips, breasts, legs. And in this case, I focused for this series, for this piece at Wave Hill, I focused on the legs. I focused on these stacked high heels, these stiletto heels that reoccur. And sometimes they're one, sometimes they're multiples. And the idea that, we are sort of, we're objectified by what we wear and how we present ourselves. The sort of female expose and presentation runs through my work as part of my investigation. And so I wanted to include that in the flora and fauna. I wanted to include this female-like form that, after really sort of studying it and making many different iterations, I felt like it was very similar to some of the plant life, and that our bodies are plant-like, are natural. And, these things, at first glance, I don't necessarily want the viewer to know right away. And I've been in this space, and I've heard people remark like, "Oh, it looks like feet, it looks like high heels." And so that to me is really wonderful, because it is sort of a process, and also it becomes visible, it becomes in focus. So, yeah.
And then speaking to repetition that you had mentioned, that also carries throughout your work.
Yeah, I mean, I really love grids. I've always been somebody who wanted to, as an artist, wanted to sort of claim the modernist grid for myself as well. And the idea that you can make comparative studies was something that really interests me, thinking about my work and thinking about myself as a visual anthropologist, sort of going and sort of making specimens, recording specimens. And these are archetypes for myself, archetypes for different female bodies, marginalized bodies, and my own body, and playing with the idea of materiality, where they turn into a grid that almost reminds you of, a butterfly collection, where you can see these comparatives, but then also it's a reminder of, different genomes and decay in this case, or and the idea that repetitive nature of, we're a generation from our parents and the parents before us. And so this idea of regeneration and the human genome comes into play. And also in nature as well, with mutations found in nature. So I wanted to sort of marry those things in this project. And yeah.
And speaking of nature.
Nature. So I was also thinking about, walking the grounds at Wave Hill, but then also I had a time right before the lockdown to go back to Jamaica, and I saw my 98-year-old grandmother, and she's still there in Kingston. And in her backyard, there's the jade vine, which is on the left, and the lobster claw on the right in this image. And, I sort of started to put things together. Here I was making these stiletto ferns, but then also sort of remarking when I was there that they look so much like my stacked heels. And so really playing with that, and having the time to really push the image making to be sort of a nod to these this flora and fauna that was in my grandmother's backyard, and also a relationship and connection to the West Indies that sometimes is peripheral. So the reflective nature of the work has a distance to it, because you don't know where things start and begin because of the fractal nature and because of the reflectivity.
But you can also see that these plants seem figurative,
Yes,
right?
definitely.
So
Yeah, I mean that, there's definitely like high heels and legs and breasts, and hair even, like there's a lot of these connectivities to the nature and the body, whether we're mimetic or it's responding to us, the sort of idea of evolution and how plant life and how nature sort of kind of feeds off one another.
sure. And then
Yeah.
this notion of reflections and regrowth. I think you mentioned that the aquatic garden here also was an inspiration for your work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, upon our first tour as Wave Hill Sunroom Project artists, having the privilege to walk the grounds and really investigate and get inspiration for the project initially, the aquatic pool did have that sense of disorientation, infinite sight, but also reflecting back on itself. And I really liked the idea of that it sort of reminded me of the material I've been using in the three-dimensional world. And so I definitely, this was something that was part of my effect, what I wanted to sort of give the effect of an infinite field, an infinite place where my objects would live.
And then you had also, not pictured here, but the compost pile.
The compost pile is the last stop on our artist tour. And what was really exciting about the compost pile, this is great, yeah, is that we went down to it and it was just this massive mound of earth. And then there was all this regeneration. There was all this life growing out of this compost, which is what, compost is supposed to do, and also nurture, minerals and all this stuff. So I really kind of took away from that idea of how can I make this idea of regrowth and regeneration, things that are coming out of the ground, but maybe things are reflected into it as well. And that's sort of, in this sort of detail, that's kind of what's happening with this fire glass that I'm using, along with the double-sided acrylic mirror, to sort of play off this idea of compost also meets sand, also meets, so there's some tropical reflection, no pun intended, but the idea of these, of everything sort of reflecting and refracting off of one another. Yeah.
And this idea of reflections externally, reflections internally, how does that connect with the complexity of your Caribbean American heritage? I know you explore that throughout your work.
Yeah, I think about the idea of, invisible blackness and the complexity of ambiguous identity at times, where I can kind of shapeshift and be in and out of spaces, whether I'm welcomed in those spaces or not. And I feel like the idea that being peripheral, thinking about double consciousness and thinking about those themes in the work, looking at oneself and then what's being reflected to you, or thinking about the sort of macro aggressions of, you don't look Jamaican, that those sort of ideas of, well, what is a Jamaican supposed to look like? So these are sort of the complexities of being intersectional, biracial, thinking about what peripheral edges I'm in and out of. And then the piece itself, Fragments of Perception, plays into that idea of what are these objects? I can identify them, they're identifiable, but where do they start and where do they begin? And that kind of idea of identity in culture, or my identity in several cultures, in multicultures, is sort of part of this exploration in the 3D.
Mm-hmm. And do you see, for the visitors who are walking and experiencing your installation that their reflections are also in your piece and it reflects upon themselves.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the idea that the mirrors reflect and refract everything, and the visitors themselves, it's almost, there's this interaction that's playing with the hanging strands of, you know, stiletto fern heels and sort of hanging in the air, and the idea that it will pick up color, it'll pick up pattern, it'll pick up the light. And that really plays into the work itself. I really want the viewer to, in some cases, be familiar and disoriented with it. And I think that there's something about that's reflected in my intersectionality in that way.
And here we have a close-up look of the negative parts from the stiletto heels. And it looks like, I mean, they look like forms that could occur in nature. They could also look like parts of stiletto heels. Can you talk about that process of ending up using that negative space?
Yeah, you know, these were very delicate items, delicate pieces. And, you know, a lot of the times I utilized all the negative space because they did look like plant forms. They did look like ferns and other tropical plants that I'm familiar with. And so I wanted to utilize everything. So almost as if this was a compost heap, I'm utilizing all the negative spaces and pieces of the actual sculptures themselves into the space. And I like that idea of inversion and flipping back and forth, flipping between what you are seeing and what you're not seeing. And that was a big deal for me in terms of the idea that this work, you know, I'm using materials that aren't natural. And, you know, with my flat work, it's gouache and paper and water. And here is this material that I need fabricators for, and I need to be collaborative in my process, creation and making. And so in that case, I wanted to use all the scraps, all the end pieces, all the negative space. So if you go to Wave Hill, which I hope you do, you will see that I put in all the extra pieces that have come out of the laser cut prints.
And then that makes, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the skylights. Like, I mean, that was one reason for sort of, you know, proposing this space and this piece. It had different iterations in the beginning, but like utilizing that light for me was, you know, was everything. And that light is part of the work. It is, you know, it is part of the material of the piece. I should just put that in there. Double-sided mirrored acrylic, you know, fiberglass and light as part of this piece, because you can see at certain times of the day, and I'm sure, you know, everyone at Wave Hill can see certain times of the day you get different types of environments in the space. And I wanted that as well. You know, I wanted, you know, at 12 noon, what will happen in the afternoon, a cloudy day, the sunset, and all those things are actually elements in my studio practice, painting sunsets and thinking about the idea of reflection of space. And there's, you know, and maybe even alienation in this too. There's a lot of moments where you can't necessarily see your face because the width of the ferns are so small that you really have to stay still almost to see your reflection, or you have to crouch down to really kind of look and try and figure out where the plant life comes out of.
And then when you had mentioned about your two-dimensional work and the pieces of paper, or in this case, the pieces of acrylic mirror, it just makes me think of, you know, you're creating a collage or assemblage in this piece too. So, and how that's carried throughout your entire practice.
Yeah, I definitely think that disparate things coming together, you know, to make a form or an object. In my two-dimensional work, I'm taking pieces and parts I'm making my own collage material to then utilize. And, you know, this idea that bringing together different images, or in this case, there's about 4 or 5 different elements in this one work. And sort of, you know, even the height of the base was something that was part of this collaged experience, you know, how I wanted it to become human scale, but then also be an overgrowth above. And so playing with that, also the light and the reflection of the light becomes part of the collage, because you're getting different nuances of light, almost as if it's, there was one day I was in the gallery and during install, and all the light sort of changed a bit, and it looked like a thunderstorm cloud with a lightning inside of it. I mean, so it's really interesting how, you know, the idea of putting the ferns at certain heights, staggering them to create a sort of a visual lit collage in many cases too.
I mean, that really came together during the installation. I know you had planned to a T the length of the fishing wire, but there were some things that had to be figured out right on site during install.
Yes, I literally had to prune the height, and I was there with my, you know, scissors, sort of cutting and adjusting, and also trying to figure out how to make them suspend was something that was really exhausting and exciting. You know, figuring out tools I didn't think I'd ever have to buy or have in my studio, now that I have. An electrical crimper, you know, these kinds of things that make the challenge of making site-specific pieces exciting and more appealing. You know, I say that now, but but I really love the idea that, you know, especially with the pandemic, the idea of bringing this in and having the time to show it after all this time. And it's also thinking about the idea of reflection and who we are, and, you know, it's a piece that people can sit with, I hope, and experience it, and all the colors that it reflects the history of the gallery space. It reflects the history of the land beyond it. It's really, really, I think it becomes its own part of Wave Hill.
Definitely. And shall we take a look at another video clip?
Sure.
Now I'd like to bring in Gian Her, who has an exhibition in the adjoining space. And it'd be great to have you both in conversation. And this is Gian's installation, so we can be near. So the sun porch is off where my cursor is, off to the left. Hi, Gian. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Gian.
And I just want to show a couple of more images of recent ones that we just had before we launch into our conversation. Shoshanna, you're mentioning capturing images at different times of the day in different climates. We had the storm come through.
That's awesome.
And our gallery creator, Madeline captured this amazing, this is around 4 o'clock. It got very dark in the gallery, and it reflects off of Gian's installation, and they look like lightning bolts.
Yeah, or like even fireflies too, like just thinking about being upstate recently, and and wow, it like reflect that yellow is just like this blast that also reminds me of Gin's work in the next space, you know, that sort of that luminescence. 4 o'clock. It looks like it's much later, which is, I was very curious about how this piece lives at night. I'm, I'm sure again, same thing, you feel the same way. Like, how does my piece, live at night? And because it's all my space is all natural light, like what would it be like with a full moon? Or, I mean, these are things that I think about. I have to maybe bring a GoPro and leave it in the gallery. But having a life of its own and then reflecting, that's really wonderful. Wow, that's great.
So I wanted to bring you both into conversation. It's been a year and a half since this journey started, and it's amazing to see both of your installations come to fruition. I mean, it was postponed because of the pandemic. It was supposed to be spring of last year. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, like, during this time, you're introduced to each other in the beginning, and then you've continued this conversation and dialogue, and how the connection between both your works and the conversations you've had amongst yourselves affected your process.
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to work with Yin. And I think that during our installations, I think that there is this birthing, like we were having our children in this space. I think that the anticipation of creating works that also have a wonderful dialogue with each other. We talked about that, like an immigrant story, and the idea that we have reflection, we have reflective material in the space. And it doesn't necessarily, it informs each other. It doesn't compete with each other. And I think that that is like so magical. And during install, just, giving each other time and support, through a stop and a look and okay, we're doing that now. All right. Or, a moment, a tearful moment, and totally understanding the kind of time and effort that we both have, and that again you have with your piece, is so beautiful and poetic. And then I think that the poetry that you include, and the physical poetry that you have, and then the physical poetry that I have, really sort of marry quite well, and then also gives our own voices.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, what an honor and joy. My heart still sort of like does this when I think about the time of installing together with you in the space, and what a beautiful sort of like, I don't know, curation, Eileen, again, that you put us together, and that you knew somehow that our works and our temperaments and our stories were going to speak to each other. And I really appreciated that trust. You're right. I think for 1.5 years during the pandemic, there wasn't actually as much of that conversation between Shoshanna and I. And I suppose many of us have gone through that pandemic in aloneness, as we were going through tremendous losses in both our private lives and also collectively. I just kind of went inward, and I continue to let ideas for the show simmer and continue to think about ideas of loss and beauty. But really, Wave Hill and installing at the site with Shoshanna was one of my very first physical contact with another artist, like re-entering the world. And I'm getting chills talking about it, because what a beautiful way for me to re-enter and to be received by another, beautiful, sensitive, generous, and intellectual artist, right? Who's working alongside with you. And it's rare that, you feel that much of a connection and respect as your work is unfolding simultaneously. And that, and it was like kind of interesting, sometimes I was just kind of look at my space and look at her space, like unfolding these like fiber glasses like all over, and it's like fracturing the lights in the space, and I'm just like recording you because it just looked so beautiful. And like during the lunchtime on the porch, we're just eating, and it's like, Shoshana, you know, like I realized, and I'm just kind of able to unravel things with her. And one thing that I thought a lot about is the actual composition of the installation. You know, how Shoshana's work is really kind of the concentration of the materiality and reflections, like really encapsulated, right? In the center of it all with her base, and then it's just kind of doing this. And how I guess my work was trying to sort of expand it out and anchor towards the edges of the gallery, right? And so it was really beautiful to just kind of have those like small moments of like realizing and learning more about my own work as well as Shoshana's, because we were in conversation. So
Yeah, I definitely loved, you all have to go see the work, but you know, the teardrops that you have, Jen, filled with water, and the idea that I'm doing a reflecting pool, and you're kind of encapsulating water, and then the reflections of these glass sculptures that you've had someone hand blown, to this idea of collaboration in the work, the idea that we both had to collaborate with fabricators or artisans, and bring that to our works. And there's a sense of, we're both people who like control. I know we do. That's a good thing. And having and seeing it being created is something that is, I think, what makes me want to be in my studio every day. Is seeing something being created and seeing the kind of sort of going over the obstacles and finding the challenges at last minute. And I know we'll probably talk about your last minute decision that, and just this idea that you're not competing. I think that was really nice in terms of installing with another artist. So sometimes there's a sense of competition, and I feel like we were both there, and we were there in it. You could see the sweat equity. You could see, all the work that you'd put into it. And I love the idea that we both had the same height same height structures, which was we didn't plan that, but the idea that sort of runs the sight line into and flows back into the sun porch and the sunroom. Really beautiful. So it was a pleasure, and I thank you, Eileen. I couldn't be any luckier with being paired with such a amazing, smart, and thoughtful artist.
Well, thank you both so much. And I just want to say, thinking about, again, you mentioned that you're working during the pandemic alone, and same, it's just like knowing how or seeing how each of your works have developed over time. And then it's almost like you have this telepathy or some sort of connection with each other without even knowing it, because then it ended up, because from the proposal to how, your installation ideas have shifted, through this year and a half, it was kind of still running along. There are a lot of parallels in your work. And then finally, when it came to fruition, there are even more connections between the reflections and the mirrors. So it's just been an amazing journey, to experience this with you both.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear.
Yeah,
It feels like a long journey,
long journey. And I do go back to that, materiality, right? Like both in Shoshana's work, and especially Shoshana's work, using the mirror as kind of, how do you say, it manifests the idea of, plants and migration and bodies and stories. Like it sort of like has all of those things, and when I think about my usage of mirrors as well, and how we're using both very, I don't know, I think mirrors and glass are one of the most alluring material ever, because it is so reflective, and it is so, I don't know, it's fragile, it's sparkly, and people just immediately also know what to do when they see a mirror, because we see mirrors, right? And we see ourselves reflected through it. We groom ourselves front of it. We pose, front of it, and we look at each other together to the mirror, right? And it's a constant ask of, to reflect upon ourselves. And for Shoshanna to have that kind of strategy to just put it, out there and say, I know these look beautiful, don't they? Especially in the sun porch, with these vines all around and these windows and the daylight coming in. And I think that sort of claiming the space, knowing how beautiful your installation is, and that how much that was going to actually allure the audience in, and I've seen people engaging with your piece, they recognize the movement and they start to recognize themselves in the space and they start taking photos. So this progression of their physical interaction, hopefully then eventually emotional interaction with your work, and some people are going to choose to engage with it a little longer than others, but I just thought that even your particular choice, the language of your title of the show, the perception of fragments, and kind of having these different tactics of protecting your story while letting people know that there's some stuff going on that I want to tell you, but you're gonna have to really engage with it. And I know it's beautiful, and I want you to take some time to look at it. So I really appreciated that, because I think that's also a similar way that I engage in my process. That beauty becomes, not only something that I have a very romantic notion of what beauty is, and I want my work to be beautiful, but that it's also one of the strategies for people to stay with you, and I think your work does that so beautifully.
Thank you. Oh, I can't wait for your talk. I mean, there's like this idea of, like you mentioned it, like there's taking this space and owning the space, and that's something that your work does in the space, and how people interact with your piece and my piece at the same levels almost. That people both have to get engaged onto the ground and engaged onto the wall and see the reflections within those elements. And you even have an exposed element, purposefully exposed with the lighting. I mean, it's just, there's this idea of like the sensitivity of color and light. And so stay tuned.
Yeah. I feel like you both have created this emotive landscape, for yourselves and for the audience to really absorb.
Yeah,
Definitely
sure.
self-portraits in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me, I was just thinking a lot about the reason I think I get intrigued with the idea of installation, and how I'm starting to allow the floor installation to be open enough for my body to be a part of, is that I'm trying to find home. I think many of us want to find home, right? We do have our physical homes and where we come from, things like that. But I think, and Eileen, I know that as Asian American curator, you also kind of relate to that diasporic narrative, in which there are many different kinds of, I think, losses, right? In your in all of our collective narratives as diaspora, and even if not as a diasporic person, I think we all want to belong somewhere, and it's very difficult to find places in which you truly feel like you belong in external world, because it is so imperfect, and so when I was creating that space at Wave Hill, and again, sunroom, just that space just makes me want to cry, because it's such a beautiful space, and I think I was able to find my temporary home and sanctuary. And I think ultimately that's why we do what we do, because we just want to find home and peace in which our hearts can lie within, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Gyun, for joining us. So Gyun's talk will be next Thursday, same time at 2 p.m., the 17th. And Shoshanna will be our special guest
Okay.
for that program. I'm going to open this up to the audience if you have any questions. You can either ask in the chat if it's easier, or in the Q&A section. Or I can just continue asking you questions, Shoshanna.
Go away, go for it. Ask.
Can you talk about this dichotomy of the fragile versus, it's not really a dichotomy, but the fragility of nature with maybe the danger of the sharpness, of the acrylic material that you're using?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the drawing that I made was specifically very pointed heel, and at first I didn't really think about the materiality and how that print would come out, the laser print. And I really like the idea of not smoothing the edges and making them sharp, thinking about, the idea that perception is sometimes manipulated, and that sometimes, with stereotypes, with marginalization. So I kind of wanted to have these sort of very delicate elements in the space be sort of something that was slightly dangerous. I mean, there's a lot of plants out there that are really beautiful and delicate, but they're poisonous. And I wanted to kind of play off that idea. Yeah, and also like how sort of perceptions and sort of neocolonialism and the idea of the Caribbean being a magical place, but there's so much reality that tourism doesn't tell people, and how people live there is it's not just beach bums and rastas. There's lots of history there. And so I think the idea of history of an island in a place and identity is not necessarily soft, and that there is diverse and complicated identity. And so that's sort of leaving those leaves sharp, is definitely.
Plus, there's the notion of exoticism that gets fetishized,
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the idea of the female body, marginalized bodies, my body being fetishized, wanting to keep those stacked stiletto heels as part of the image making and the subject matter in this work, to keep that continuum. That strange fruit sort of lives, but she's now, she's morphed into this form.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to ask a question from Karayun. Karayun asks, what was the biggest challenge you overcame and which were immobile?
Well, I would say the biggest challenge was working with a fabricator, to be honest with you. After we had lockdown, and right before, I think that was March of 2020, nobody really wanted to help or work with me, even if we were going to work remotely. And so that was a big challenge for me. And then with the Form Design Studio in Newark coming through last August with, helping me, the challenge was I wanted to make works that were larger, but because the fabricators weren't available, they were making, PPE. And here I am like, oh, I'm an artist. Can you make these double-sided mirrors? I had to sort of think about the challenges around me during the pandemic, what was available to me, and how to utilize and how to rescale the installation based on, what was available to me. So that, I think, was the biggest challenge. And the fragility of the forms, they're so fragile. So making sure that everything was sort of packed the right way and put in place, and not having necessarily the ability to come up to Wave Hill during the pandemic to sort of really kind of experience the space a few more times. So I really had to kind of think remotely and think about how the work was going to live. And I kind of made, some some setups in my studio here, and took it, just sort of really trying to figure out how it was going to navigate in my mind.
Mhm. And I know you had the maquette of the space and all the dimensions and planning it out. I'm just curious, as everyone can see in the background here, the wisteria, the lushness of the leaves. Did that outside environment, did you take that in consideration for the installation?
Definitely. I mean, I definitely wanted to do hanging vines with these plant lives, with the lobster claw, with the jade vine. I wanted to do more of them, actually. But my budget, is my thing. But I wanted to play off the idea of coming into an environment and making it centralized, thinking about the aquatic pool and how you walk around it at Wave Hill, and it reflects the sky. So it's this sort of infinite landscape, and I really wanted to do the same on a vertical and horizontal framework and perspective. To thinking about the idea of things being vertically from perspective and things horizontally in that perspective as well.
I mean, vertically, it'd be kind of into the infinite depths of the pool or the reflective surface.
Yeah, and there's some really lovely moments when you can look down and see the reflection kind of going in the opposite direction. Thinking about the hall of infinite mirrors, or infinite mirrors. That idea that it just continues to go on through this perception in your brain that the image is extended, and I like that idea, and of exploiting the light and the environment around it.
Mm-hmm. So your work has that verticality, and Gyen's has the horizontality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that there's something about getting down to the earth with hers, and thinking about the water, and thinking about the garden in her piece, and then my piece is about thinking about extorting the light and utilizing the light that's coming in from all directions in a vertical and horizontal place. Being able to look down into the space or look up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what's next for you now that you have these, you've gone in this new direction.
I'm starting a new series based on these forms, and a new drawing series that will then sort of inform another group of installations with these pieces. And I would hopefully like to do a few more that have different types of forms that are related or nod to the muses that I use, not just strange fruit. And I'm always drawing, so that will be something that will always stay within the context of the work. But this I think maybe moving towards more less figurative and more of an abstraction, and sort of sitting with this work and reacting to it on a two-dimensional in a two-dimensional space, and output will be something that I'm really excited to do. I'm so excited to get back into the studio and and have this as the catalyst to kind of go forward with my mark making, expanding my visual language. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you mentioned less figurative, but there's such a embodiment of the human form in these more abstracted.
I think maybe
features.
There's something that's more. I've been thinking of them as specimens and not as sort of species, like plant life species. So kind of like playing around with that idea, and then maybe marrying some of my other Invisible Visibility series, which kind of plays off with this work, and Strange Fruit series in sort of a context of maybe a larger conversation in my studio practice.
Oh, thank you so much, Shoshanna. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Jesse, Gyan, and Madeline.
Thank you, everybody.
And the show is up through June 27th. So please come on by. And again, hope to see you next Thursday for a Gittens talk.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Goodbye.